All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Interfaith Friends of UCLA. Thank you, Dr. Kraus, and thank you, Dr. ElMasry, for joining me here today to debate. I think it's important that we put our ideas to the test, and I can think of no one better to challenge me than the sharp-witted Dr. ElMasry. So right out the gate, I'll admit that Dr. ElMasry is debating the dominant view in Islamic history, which is the idea that Islam is the only path to salvation. However, it wasn't the only view in Islamic history, nor was it, as I will argue, the earliest, and it is not consistent with the Quran. In order to argue this, I will be using the historical critical perspective. I do that because I'm trained in Western Quranic studies, and I focus on Islamic origins and the quest for the historical Muhammad. Now, based on that, I will say these are the sources I will rely on because these are what historians think are reliable and go back to the Prophet Muhammad. First and foremost is the Quran, which the vast majority of scholars do believe goes back to him, and that's due to manuscript evidence and a few other things as well. The second is the Constitution of Medina, or the Ummah document, which even the most skeptical scholars believe does go back to the Prophet Muhammad. Third, we're going to look at physical evidence. And fourth, we will be looking at early contemporaneous non-Muslim sources, which are often in Syriac. What we will not be relying on is the following: hadith, seerah, tafsir, asbab al-nuzul, or views attributed to the Salaf. These are all considered by scholars to be reflective of later theology that is then back projected. So from a Western historical critical perspective, we think this is more about reception history. Now, as historians of religion...
Could you perhaps explain what these sources that you will not consider, they all seem to be in a foreign language?
Oh, these are reports from the Prophet or about the Prophet.
Okay.
So now, as historians of religion acknowledge, religions usually begin with what are called fuzzy borders. That is to say, it takes time for social religious movements to develop into fully discrete or reified institutionalized religions. That is, with sharp boundaries dividing one religion from another. And the names of religions almost always arise much later in their history and are then back projected onto the time of origins. The question is Islam an exception? Well, the word Islam does occur in the Quran itself, so you might think it is. However, as W.C. Smith recognized, the term Islam is used in the Quran very differently than the way you and I use it today as a discrete and institutionalized religion. So what does the word Islam mean in the Quran? Well, Islam has three meanings. The first is the literal, or what even we can call the existential meaning. Muslim simply means in Arabic submitter, and it really implies submitter to God. Similarly, Islam then is just submission to God. In other words, it is the stance of wholehearted, unconditional, and exclusive self-abandonment in and absolute devotion to God. The second meaning is the generalized, or actually the universal meaning, which is related to the first meaning and means the absolute devotion of one's worship to God. In other words, the committed monotheism of the primordial, timeless religion with God. And the third way to use Islam is the way you and I know it, which is Islam as an institutionalized religion, having a time-initiated beginning with Muhammad and requiring the affirmation of Muhammad as one's religious prophet. This understanding of Islam is not present in the Quran. Now, one of the first people to really talk about this in great depth was Professor Fred Donner in his famous book, Muhammad and the Believers. He noticed that the word Muslim is only used about 75 times in the Quran. Meanwhile, the word mu'min is used, which means believer, around almost 1,000 times. So concluding from this, he came to the realization that the Prophet's followers were actually initially called mu'minun, as opposed to muslimun, that is, believers. And Muslim, according to him, means a committed monotheist, and Islam means committed monotheism in the sense of submitting oneself to God's will. In other words, the first two definitions I gave you. He also realized that the Prophet's early following was ecumenical. That is, it was multi-faith and consisted of Jews and Christians, as well as perhaps other monotheists. This is known as the Pan-Abrahamic thesis and has become increasingly mainstream in the study of classical Islam. I want to clarify some terms and refine Donner's thesis a little bit. So in actuality, the narrower term is mu'min, which means believer. It means a believer in God and Muhammad and a follower of Quranic law. On the other hand, Muslim is the wider term. It refers to a submitter to God, that is, a submitting monotheist, and it includes Jews, Christians, and perhaps other monotheists who submitted to God and to the godly community, even as they followed their own scriptures and religious laws, and that is the key part. So what does this Quran say on salvation? Well, when you see these words, no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve, you know that it's talking about salvation, that it's a saved group it's talking about, or a saved person. Because the very next verse, of course, mentions the Garden of Paradise. So who is saved according to the Quran? Well, let's look at this verse. Whosoever submits their face to God while being virtuous shall have their reward with their Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. And I hope for the live stream now, it should be going to the slides. Okay, so if you look at this verse, it uses the word aslama, which is related to Islam. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's referring only to Muslims in Islam. However, if we look at this verse, verse 262 of the Quran, it says, truly those who believe, that is in the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, and those who are Jews and the Christians and the Sabians, whosoever believes in God in the last day and works righteousness shall have their reward with their Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. This is the most clear and explicit verse in the Quran on this topic, and I feel like this could be the end of the debate. Of course, the other side will naturally have its ways of explaining this verse. I think it's explaining away this verse, but I will let my interlocutor raise his arguments and then I will counter them. Now, one thing that you notice though, is that in this verse, it says Jews and Christians, but it does not say Judaism and Christianity. That is because the Quran judges salvation based on your individual virtue and merit. And also, according to the Quran, there's really only one true religion, and that is God's religion, the religion with God. This is the same religion that has historically manifested itself throughout time. So it's the religion that was preached by Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and the Prophet Muhammad. And it's always opposed to idolatry. As the Prophet Muhammad is instructed in the Quran to say that he is not bringing anything new. It's the same message. Now, the Quran has various names for this one true religion. It's sometimes just called the religion, God's religion, the pure religion, the upright religion, the religion of truth, Din al-Haq, the religion of submission, that's Din al-Islam, which is absolute devotion and worship to God, or committed monotheism, and the religion of primordial monotheism, al-Hanafiya. Now, what does the word Muslim mean? Again, we said that this means submitter in the Arabic. Let's take a look at this verse. This is Prophet Joseph who said, "My Lord, take me as a submitter unto yourself and admit me to the company of the righteous." Now, this was long before Prophet Muhammad was alive. Surely we're not saying that this is referring to the institutionalized religion of Islam or the institutionalized version of Muslim. This is clearly an existential state. As one scholar put it, when Joseph demanded to die as a Muslim in his prayer, and Abraham described himself as a Muslim, they did not mean that they were members of the institutionalized religion of the Prophet Muhammad. Rather, they meant to submit to God and to obey God's orders. If we look at this verse over here, it's showing that the entire universe submits to God. Do you seek other than God's religion, while whatsoever is in the heavens and the earth submits, aslama, to him, willingly or unwillingly? Now, as I said, it also has a universal meaning related to religion or religious worship, which is referring to the primordial religion. Here in this verse, we see, set your face to religion as a primordial monotheist, and it's always connected to this word hanif, in the primordial nature from God upon which he originated humankind. And this is the upright religion. Remember, another name for God's religion. And it's always opposed to idolatry. Here in the very next verse, we actually see that the Quran is actually criticizing religious chauvinism or exclusivism or sectarianism, about breaking and dividing up into different religions, each side rejoicing in what it has and saying, what I have is better than yours. So the question is, are only Muslims following the upright religion? Well, no, because look at this verse, verse 98:5. The people of the book follow the upright religion. Yes, some of them are disbelievers, but it's always a part of them that are referred to as disbelievers. But some of them are believers. Truly, those who believe and perform righteous deeds, it is they who are the best of creation. So surely they are part of the saved group. So I agree with Professor Lombard, who says, Al-Islam refers to the universal pre-sectarian submission to God, which is the quintessence of all virtuous religions. It is the attitude of submission that is believed to be inherent in true faith. So even though the Quran conceptualizes it as there is one true God's religion, it manifests itself in different, what we could call sub-religions, or different codes of holy laws and religious paths. So in this verse of the Quran, for each community among you, we have appointed a religious law and a religious path. And had God willed, he would have made you one community, but he willed otherwise. So it doesn't say argue amongst yourself and bicker. It says, so race with one another in good deeds. So we see that according to the Quran, there's Jewish law, there's Islamic law. These are different manifestations of the one true religion. When religious pluralists say that there are multiple paths to God, we see that's in the Quran itself, with each community having a path. Now, in some sense, it's the same path. So the way I think of it is a highway. A highway has multiple lanes. So the highway is the deen, and then the different lanes are the different religions that you and I know. So the Quran is endorsing divinely ordained religious diversity. Here's another verse. For every community, we have appointed a religious rite so that they may mention the name of God. Notice it validates these different religious rites in the different religions because they're all worshiping God. Your God is one God, so submit unto him. And then for every religious community, we have appointed a rite, a religious rite they are to perform. So don't argue about it. So al-Islam is the primordial form. It is the primordial form of religion. And each of the specific religions are historical manifestations of God's religion. As Fred Donner says, the Quran implies that the Torah was viewed by the believers as one edition or avatar of God's law, with the Quran being another edition or avatar of God's law. So when we look at these verses of the Quran, which are used by religious exclusivists, we need to understand what they're actually saying. Truly, the religion in the sight of God is al-Islam. This is referring to absolute devotion to God or committed monotheism. Whosoever seeks a religion other than al-Islam, this again is referring to absolute devotion to God or committed monotheism. And similarly with 5:3, this day I've perfected for you your religion. The reason why it's perfected, it's because it's the same religion. It's God's religion. And I've approved for you as religion, submission, or absolute devotion to God. Now, the slam dunk argument in favor of this is the fact that this verse, 319, there's actually a Quranic variant in Ibn Masud's Codex, which reads and glosses it as Al-Hanafiya As-Samha, or the primordial, generously tolerant religion. So the verse reads, truly the religion in the sight of God is the primordial, generously tolerant religion, which takes the verse in the exact opposite direction of the religious exclusivist. Also, we know that it is referring to absolute devotion and worship to God, since that same verse, 5:3, is actually mentioning offerings to other gods. Forbidden unto you are that which has been offered to other than God, sacrificed on stone altars, and that which you allot divining arrows. That is evil. That's the context in which the next part arises. It's not just random that that first part is there. This is actually not just religion, but it's talking about religious worship. As my own advisor at Harvard has written a paper that's coming out that shows that deen actually has an implication of religious worship. So here, what God has approved for you as religious worship is absolute devotion of your worship to God. So what does the Quran say on the people of the book? People of the book, by the way, for those of you who don't know, are the Jews and the Christians. So as Fred Donner writes, whenever the Quran refers to the people of the book in general, the tone is always positive. When it is critical of the people of the book, it almost always makes sure to say a part of the people of the book and never passes blanket judgments on them. This suggests that the Quran is worried about individual faith and virtue and not passing judgments on entire groups of people based on what confessional group they belong to. Now, there are verses of the Quran that are critical of the Jews and the Christians, but it always says a group among them. And this is the verse that you should always keep in mind whenever you see such criticism. Verse 3:113. But they are not all alike. Among the people of the book is an upright community. Again, this is hearkening back to the upright religion, who recite God's signs. They believe in God and the last day. In fact, the Quran even uses the word salihin, or the righteous, which is deeply religious terminology. It even calls them muttaqin, which is reverent. And here is clear verbiage about salvation. Whatsoever good they do, they will not be denied it. Now, interestingly enough, when the people of the book are critiqued, it's often for not following their own scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel. Here, the Quran is actually telling them to follow the Torah and criticizing them for not. Here it says in verse 393, bring the Torah and recite it. Why would this be the case? If the Torah, and as we'll see, the Gospel, was completely corrupted and abrogated by the Quran, why would the Quran be calling them to this? The Quran says it in multiple places. Truly, we sent down the Torah, wherein is a guidance and a light. Not only does it say that it's not abrogated, it says to rule by your Torah. And says, whosoever judges not by that which God has sent down, it is they who are the disbelievers. And here, even clearer, verse 547, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has sent down therein. Why would that be the case if it was so corrupted and abrogated by the Quran? Here again, had they observed the Torah and the gospel? And it says there is a moderate community amongst them. Say, O people of the book, You stand on nothing till you observe the Torah and the gospel. The Quran, far from abrogating these texts, is actually coming to confirm these texts, confirming the book that came before it, and is a protector over it. So what we can say is that the early community, sometimes we say believers community, but I like the community of submitting monotheists. This consists of the believers, which is actually the core group, the mu'minun. These were those who believed in Muhammad as their prophet and who followed Quranic law. But there were also Jews and Christians who could be considered Muslimun, submitting monotheists, if they submitted to God religiously and to Muhammad from a social and political perspective, perhaps or even likely even accepting him as a prophet sent to the Arabian Gentiles. And they were thus united with the believers. These submitting monotheists could still follow their own scriptures and religious laws, and that is the key part here. Most importantly, all of the above could secure salvation. Now you might be saying, that's kind of crazy. You're saying that Jews and Christians are Muslims? Well, it's in the Quran itself. Verse 380 is criticizing some Christians for deifying Jesus and then says, would he, Jesus, command you to disbelief after your having been Muslimun, that is, submitters? So we see that it's clearly in the Quran. When the Quran talks about the kafirs, the idolaters, which is a polemical term, it's talking about the idol worshippers or the pagans. It's not talking, it never calls the people of the book this term in a blanket way. When it does, it's always a part of them. In fact, the Jews and the Christians, they worship the same God. And the Quran says to come to a common word between us and you. We are submitters. No demand for conversion here. As historians of religion, we know that the Jews and the Christians were a part of the early community because the Quran specifically allows intermarriage and social intercourse, that is, sharing the food with them. This is a sign because we know that if the reason why these are often taboo or not allowed is because the idea is that someone has impure beliefs, therefore they are impure, therefore marriage with them is not allowed, therefore eating their food is not allowed. And we know that from the Quran itself because it forbids marriage to idolaters because of their impure beliefs. Also, the Quran says that you can only marry the righteous. So we know that the people of the book must also be counted amongst the righteous, at least some of them. And therefore, they can have salvation. Even more interesting is the fact that the Quran even allows jihad or self-defense, war, to defend monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques. Now, do you see idol-worshipping temples here? Obviously, the fact that it's defending these houses of worship means that you don't think it's just a house for polytheism and unbelief. So clearly, and this is also a sign to the historian that the early community likely contained Jews and Christians, and the historical evidence backs that up. So I have to go through the early historical sources really quickly, but I hope to recircle to this. So one of the sources is the Constitution of Medina, which shows that this is a document from Muhammad the Prophet between the believers and the submitters. This is, by the way, how we know that these are two different groups. And later, Islamic theology is kind of confused. What are these two different groups? And it says, verily, they are one community to the exclusion of all other people. Even more explicitly, this document says the Jews are a ummah, a community with the believers. Now, we use the word ummah now in a completely exclusivist way, that it's just the Muslim ummah. This is not how this early document is saying it. Not only that, but in red, you see the Jews have their religious law and the Muslims have their religious law, exactly consistent with the thesis that I have provided today. You can also look at contemporaneous non-Muslim historical sources, which reveal that even after the Prophet's death, there were still Jews and Christians, we'll see, who would say, we are Muslims. According to early Syriac sources, Jews and Christians were members of the early movement of Islam even after the Prophet's death. There's even evidence of repressed historical memory in Islamic sources for this. There's a report, for example, the Jews and the Christians belong to the community of Muhammad. And the response was, of course, people got very angry when they heard this thing, like maybe some of you are right now. Now, I want to circle back to the Quran for my opening and talk about the Quran's view on religious exclusivism. The Quran considers it to be part of your vain hopes that you're going to be saved based on what religious community you belong to. And it criticizes Jews and Christians for that and says, and they said, none will enter the garden unless he be a Jew or a Christian. Those are their vain hopes. How do Muslim exclusivists read that? None will enter the garden except he be a Muslim, capital M. But clearly that's going in the opposite direction. The very next verse says, nay, whosoever submits his face to God while being virtuous shall have his reward with his Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve, which harkens back to 262, as I said, which specifically includes Jews, Christians, and Sabians, whosoever believes in God. The Quran condemns same-sex mentality. This verse says, the Jews say the Christians stand on nothing, and the Christians say the Jews stand on nothing, though they both recite the book. Of course, Muslim exclusivists read this as saying that both the Jews and the Christians stand on nothing. But really here, the verse, it says that they follow the book as if the book is still valid. So we are really taking this in the opposite direction when we take it in the exclusivist direction. Here again, the Quran says, and they say, be Jews or Christians, and you shall be rightly guided. Say rather, ours is the creed of Abraham, a primordial monotheist, a Hanif, and he was not of the idolaters. Clearly, and then it says that Abraham was not a Jew or a Christian, but rather a submitting monotheist, Hanifan Musliman. And here, Musliman is used as an adjective to Hanif, so it's clearly not being used in the institutionalized, reified sense that we use it today. Now, Muslim exclusivists will say, yeah, he was a Muslim, capital M. Come on, that goes against the exact argument that the Quran is making here against the Jews and the Christians who are being exclusivist. The Quran condemns those who say, the Jews and the Christians say, we are the children of God and his beloved ones. This is talking about salvation, because the Quran then says, say, why then does he punish you for your sins? Because God judges people and forgives people on their individual faith and virtue. He forgives whomsoever he will, and he punishes whomsoever he will. The Quran, in very powerful language, asks, does heaven belong to your religion alone, to your religious community alone? Say, this is verse 294, if the abode of the hereafter with God is yours alone, to the exclusion of other people, then long for death if you are truthful. And I say to Muslim exclusivists, then long for death. And then the Quran says, and those who believe and perform righteous deeds, it is they who are the inhabitants of the garden, therein to abide. The Quran says that God's bounty when it comes to salvation in the next life is not limited to one group. Bounty is in God's hands. He gives it unto whomsoever he will, and God is possessed of tremendous bounty. It's not limited to one group. The Quran reiterates, salvation is not based on your vain desires, but for those who believe and perform righteous deeds, we shall cause them to enter gardens of paradise. It will not be in accordance with your vain desires. That's talking to us, by the way. Vain desires that you're going to be saved because you're a Muslim or a believer. Nor the vain desires of the people of the book. Whosoever does evil shall reap its consequence, and he will find no protector or helper for himself apart from God. And whosoever performs righteous deeds, whether male or female, and is a believer, such shall enter the garden. This is powerfully pluralistic language. What direction did the Islamic tradition take this? Unfortunately, we went the exclusivist route. Not only were other religions damned, but in fact, we have this report. My community was split into 73 sects, one of which will be in paradise, and 72 in hell. And which one will not be in hell? Of course, Ahl Sunnah, my sect, basically. Everyone else is burning in hell. So it's extreme exclusivism. We even have this report, which shows the idea that God will actually substitute a Muslim who's headed to hell and will replace them with a Jew or a Christian. A ransom, the Muslim, for a Muslim or a Jew and throw a Jew or a Christian in hellfire. No, it says no Muslim man will die except that God will enter a Jew or Christian in his place in hellfire. And another report says the same thing, that it's a ransom. This goes against the teeth of the Quran. Similarly, Muslims early on came up with the idea of the Prophet's intercession to save all Muslims. So all sinners, all sinning Muslims would then get salvation. This goes also against the teeth of the Quran, which repeatedly says there will be no intercession on that day. Your fate will be based on your individual faith and your virtue. This thing is not found in the Quran at all. I will close by returning back to the Quran and show what the Quranic view on salvation is. O humankind, verse 49:13. It doesn't say, O Muslims. It doesn't even say, O believers here. It says, O humankind. Truly we created you from a male and a female, and we made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Surely the most noble of you before God are the most piously righteous of you. And I want to just close with this verse, which shows that Muslim means something else in the Quran. It's an existential state. O you who believe. Notice, this is already talking about believers. Reverence God as he should be reverenced, and die not except in a state of submission. Muslimun. So this wouldn't make sense if they were already Muslim. Muslimun here is an existential state inside the heart. God judges you based on that and your faith and your virtue. Thank you.